Hi, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derek Scott III. Today's episode is with Mark Holland. Mark is a third-generation United Methodist pastor and a General Conference Delegate from the Great Plains Annual Conference. He is Executive Director of Mainstream UMC, a United Methodist advocacy group working for unity in the body of Christ. Full disclosure, I am a member of the Mainstream Advisory Board. Mark has a public voice within the UMC, but in this interview, we're actually going to hear more of his personal story. We talk about his journey into ministry, his public service in Kansas City, Kansas, and his wider advocacy within the denomination. Mark has a keen understanding of our church's politics, and he's not afraid of being provocative. But what I think you're going to hear in this interview is that all of his work is rooted in a love for the church and a commitment to inclusion for all people. I learned so much about Mark in this conversation, and I think you will find it both interesting and inspiring. So you know what to do. Grab that notebook, that choice beverage, and let's listen to this really incredible interview with Mark Holland. Mark Holland, how you doing today?
Doing great, Derek. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm really excited to have you on the podcast, my friend. Loving some of the work that we're getting to do together these days, and just the places where we're getting to interact. So I always start the conversation, at least I try to start it at the beginning. So would love to know how you became a United Methodist Christian, God's prevenient grace acting in your life to bring you into our church.
Yeah. No, it's I'm a cradle Methodist. I was born into the parsonage of at London Heights Church here in Kansas City, Kansas. Born at a Methodist hospital with a Methodist chaplain, and my great grandfather on my dad's side was a Methodist pastor, M.E. South. He was ordained in 1920 in Rogers, Arkansas. And he served 44 years, 20 parishes in 44 years in Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. What was then the Kansas Conference, which is now the Kansas East became the Kansas East Conference, which is now the Great Plains, which is all of Kansas and Nebraska now. But he was 2 years, every appointment was 2 years and out. He actually had his books alphabetized in wooden milk crates that he could simply load into his truck and then stack back up in his new office in his new church, so they'd still be in order. So he didn't even have to pack his books. He moved so frequently. Well, my grandfather didn't want anything to do with the Methodist ministry if it meant moving that often. And so he actually went into the railroad and then real estate, though he did later become a deacon in the Presbyterian church and ran a Presbyterian camp in Arkansas until his retirement. So he actually left the railroad and went to do the Christian camp. So a call in ministry for him. When he came back, he was a lay delegate to annual conference forever in Kansas East from his local churches. So my dad was born into a church family, and he grew up in Argentine in Kansas City, Kansas. He was raised here, went to high school here, and Metropolitan Avenue Church is where he grew up and where he and my mom would be married. He went off to Baker University, which is a Methodist college in Kansas. He met my mom there, who was Baptist at the time. But she came over to the Methodists when they got married. And then I was born, his second appointment, he went off to Garrett for seminary. And then my sisters were born in Junction City when they were serving in Junction City, Kansas. And when he came back to Kansas City, I was born, and, baptized by my dad at London Heights Methodist Church. And then he was transferred to Grandview United Methodist when I was 2, and we were there till I was 10. And that church is where I received my 3rd grade Bible. And then he was transferred to Topeka. He became the conference council director in Kansas East. And it was the only time in my growing up that he wasn't my pastor. And so we went to a church in Topeka Countryside, and I was confirmed at Countryside. And then for high school, he was transferred back to Kansas City. And Lenexa United Methodist is the congregation actually that sponsored me for ordination. So 7 houses before I was 18. And, I always say my joining the church in confirmation was not the most striking commitment to Christ I made. My friends were all joining, and there were a lot of girls, and I thought maybe if I stood close to one of these tall girls in 6th grade, they'd notice that I was there. That actually didn't work out for me, but I did get confirmed in the church. But it was a few years later in high school, actually, when I was a youth delegate to annual conference in Kansas East, that I heard my call to ministry. And I usually say, most people lose their religion at annual conference. I actually heard my calling. And talked to some pastors who were sponsoring the youth at that time. I thought, well, if I talk to them and they don't think it's crazy, then it might be okay. So they didn't think it was crazy. And so I went all the way through high school. Really, I was 15. I went all the way through high school with the expectation to be a pastor. Went to college at Southern Methodist University as an undergrad to be a United Methodist pastor, and then went to seminary. And so that's been the only path I've been on for my journey. So that's kind of my ministry. And I would say my commitment to the church when I was in college, when none of my friends went to church, was a bigger commitment than confirmation was. People often celebrate the first time when you accepted Christ for the first time. I would say it was a lot harder to accept Christ later on in life, choosing to go into the ministry, choosing to get married, choosing to have kids. There's a lot of opportunities we have to accept Christ. And my first one was not the most interesting.
Wow.
So
I have so many questions, Mark, as I normally do. But I'm wondering, did you feel, not just growing up in a preacher's home, but having a legacy of preachers as well, did you feel pressure towards vocational ministry? Or
it's an interesting question that I thought a lot about. For a long time, people would say, when I was in high school and college, they say, "Oh, you're following in your dad's footsteps." I'm like, well, no, I'm doing my own thing. Well, I was following in my dad's footsteps. And what's true about the call is, in some ways, it was an option. People, if you've never been to church, the call to be a pastor is a much different thing. But having grown up in the church, I had a positive experience in the church. I had a positive experience in Sunday school and youth group. And I was involved in leadership. I was the president of my youth group. I was the president of the Conference Council on Youth Ministries. I was the president of the jurisdictional youth team for South Central my senior year in high school, and a delegate to the National Youth Ministries Organization. So all my leadership skills in high school were developed in the church. So for me, it was pretty natural, and I never felt any pressure. And what was interesting is when I was ordained deacon in 95, that was under the 92 Book of Discipline, where it was a 2-step ordination process. Now deacon is a different track altogether. But back in the day, I was ordained deacon in 94, I guess. And then in 99, I was ordained elder. And on the night that I was ordained elder, my dad came up and gave me a package, a gift, while we were standing there in the gym where annual conference was, where the ordination service was held. And my dad's not a gift giver, right? That's not his language of love. He's not a gift giver, but he gave me this gift, and he said, "Go ahead and open it." So I opened it, and it was my gosh, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it again. It was my great-grandfather's ordination certificate framed.
Mm.
And my dad said, I didn't want to give this to you sooner because I didn't want you to feel any pressure that you need to become a pastor. But now that you have, I want you to have it. And I remember when I was serving at Trinity, I told my dad, he retired, and I said, Dad, give me your ordination certificate. You're not using it. So I had in my office, all three of ours, mine, my dad's, and my great-grandfather's on my wall in my office. That meant a lot to me. And that was, I still have it, obviously.
Wow.
It's from 1920.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So my dad would never put any pressure on me. I think that I experienced my call to ministry with a lot of support from a lot of my dad's colleagues. From a lot of youth folks. I got a lot of affirmation early that it was a good calling for me.
I really appreciate sort of the way you talk about accepting Christ into your life and these multiple moments of accepting Christ. I really appreciated even naming that. Yes, confirmation, that, you know, those first opportunities are really important for sure. But there are these other moments along the way that in some respects are just as important. They're more informed for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talked about staying connected to church through your college years.
Mm-hmm.
What was that for you? Like, what was underneath all of that for you?
You know, that's interesting because I attended chapel at Southern Methodist University. Nobody else did. I mean, it was a pretty small group of church-going folks. It was on Sunday morning, which, if you know the college crowd, that's not their finest hour. And I remember Chaplain Will Finnan was a chaplain of the university at SMU. He's now in Florida.
Yes, he is.
I've been able to stay connected with him through the years. But he was the chaplain there, and he preached. And, you know, those years were formative for me because I was involved in a lot of social justice stuff on campus. SMU had missed the 60s entirely. And so my friends and I thought we should help them. We should catch them up on issues.
They probably weren't the only ones who missed the 60s, but yeah.
That's right. So, and Will Finnan in the chaplain's office was very supportive of that, you know, that work and that calling. And, you know, I attended there for 3 years, every Sunday. And I remember my senior year, I decided to go attend a church in South Dallas that was a Spanish-speaking church. And so I went down there, and it was a small Spanish language congregation, United Methodist. And I attended there for my senior year. But it was really in college, the decision to go to church. And I'd invite my friends. I'm like, you want to go? They're like, when is it? I'm like, Sunday morning. They're like, what are you doing? Nobody's getting up Sunday morning. So for me, that was that faith grounding, weekly faith grounding in worship. And I didn't have a car. So in college, my first 3 years, I didn't have a car. My senior year, I had a car. But my first 3 years, I didn't have a car on campus. So I could walk to chapel. And that was my only option for church. So.
Wow. So from SMU, you head over to Iliff?
Iliff School of Theology in Denver.
Now, I'll just say that feels, and that may be just my, you know, I've only been a United Methodist, you know, for about 20 years or so. So that feels like a theological step, if not a leap. Was that, you know, from SMU, from Kansas, it feels like going to ILIF is a different space, and was it back then, and which is actually not that long ago. And why'd you choose ILIF?
Well, I did. So it's an interesting story, actually. My dream school was Union in New York City.
Ooh.
And I knew I was going there. There was no question. So after I finished SMU, I actually moved to Colorado for a year. My uncle ran group homes out there. And so I worked at group homes for emotionally disturbed kids and drug and alcohol treatment for youth. I did that for a year while I applied to school. I was kind of burned out on school. So I thought, I'll give myself a year. I'll work for a little bit. So I moved out there with a buddy, and I worked and applied. So I applied to Union. I was accepted. I had a scholarship, and I applied, but my scientific search for seminaries went like this. I was at SMU, and I thought that was enough of the South for me in Dallas. So I ruled out Perkins, Duke, and Candler.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to live in Ohio, so that cut 2 more out. I didn't want to live in New Jersey, so that cut 1 out. And I didn't really want to move out to California, so that cut Claremont out. So I circled ILIF, Wesleyan, DC, and Boston University, and Union. And the others were superfluous. I was going to Union. So I applied, I got in, and I went in February. I graduated college in 91, so 92, the spring of 92. I would start seminary in the fall of 92. But in spring, I went and visited at student days at Union for the students who were coming. So I'd been accepted, I'd done everything, and I showed up in New York. And of course, it's the Upper West Side. I mean, it's right by Riverside Church. It's just this, it's in consortium with Columbia University. I mean, it's everything, a kid from Kansas could want. But I went to Union, and I had a terrible experience. And I've talked to some people later who said the early 90s at Union was kind of a dark time. But I remember sitting down in a class, I'm a prospective student, and I sit down in class, I'm early, so I'm waiting for class to start. And a woman comes in and says, "You're sitting in our spot." I said, "Our spot? We have spots?" She said, "Yeah, you can't sit there." And I said, "Well, why can't I sit? I mean, what?" And she said, "No, this is where the lesbian students sit." I said, "Oh," I said, "Well, where does a prospective student sit in this class?" And she said, "Well, you'll sit over there. Those seats are available." Well, folks sat in class in caucuses, apparently. And then that happened a second time in another class with another group, told me to move. So I learned after that, I went to 2 more classes, I think, but I learned, don't sit down until someone else comes in the room and ask them where you can sit. And so that wasn't good. But then the worst was there was a woman there who was an ethicist, and I forget her name, but she was super impressive and famous and amazing. And we were in the dining hall, which, of course, the architecture at Union is just spectacular. We're in this beautiful dining hall, this Harry Potter-esque dining hall. And we're sitting at these, sitting in chairs, and they had the faculty presentation, a faculty panel. And it was amazing. I mean, the faculty were brilliant and engaging and interesting. And she gave an amazing talk, and she closed it by saying, and my favorite theologian is not a theologian at all, but a Black lesbian separatist, Bell Hooks. And she gave this beautiful quotation from Bell Hooks that just tied everything she said up in a bow. And it was perfect. And I'm like, okay, see, this is why I want to be here. Well, a Black student, prospective student, stood up, and he said, when it was question and answer time, he said, "Well, I have a question for you. You mentioned a Black lesbian separatist, but what about Romans that says homosexuality is wrong?" Well, she stood up and pointed at him and said, "If you don't like our kind of diversity, I suggest you leave." And I sat there and watched the only 3 Black people in the room stand up and walk out.
Oh, boy.
And they were kind of locals from Harlem. They were looking at the seminary. And they walked out. They said, okay, and they walked out. So I'm standing with a group of students afterwards, and I said, I said, that was outrageous. And they're like, I know, can you believe that guy said that? And I said, well, wait a minute. I can't believe a professor told Black students to leave. And they said, well, he's a fundamentalist. I said, well, look, if we're not in conversation with fundamentalists in this country, we're not in the Christian dialogue. And somebody else said they have nothing to contribute. So I'm thinking, I'm a straight white guy that wants to be a United Methodist pastor in Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell am I doing here? Right? What am I doing here? And the irony of this is I was one of the most liberal students at SMU, advocating for issues on race and homosexuality and all these different issues. And I get to Union and, I'm chopped liver.
Yeah.
So I decided, okay, I'm not going. So and then at ILIF, in an unrelated story, I had interviewed for their presidential scholarship. They have one in leadership and one in academics. And I received their scholarship for leadership, which was a full ride scholarship, full tuition and a stipend. And I thought, I can't turn this down. I mean, I had a scholarship from Union that was basically the same amount of money, but it was probably half the cost and not the full cost. And I said, well, that seals the decision. I'm going to go to ILIF. But I didn't know anything about it, which was a mistake. So I went in the fall. This is a true story. I had gone to my first class, the first week of class. I walked into the field ed office and I said, I want a student appointment, while I'm in seminary. I want to preach at a church. And the guy looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, we don't have any of those appointments. I said, what? You're the field ed office. You have all the connections, and how does that work? He said, no, we don't have the demographics out here. I said, well, at SMU, all the students at Perkins were at churches, and at St. Paul and Kansas City, all the folks are serving churches. And I said, yeah, that's Texas and Kansas. That's very different from here. So we just don't have that. We don't have them. You'll have to find your own place to serve in ministry. So that was shocking. You'd think someone would do that research before they applied to a seminary. You'd think before you moved in and signed up and got your class list, you would think about your field ed experience, which I didn't. So I ended up actually working at a group home for 2 years, Disciples of Christ group home for 2 years in Denver, which was a great experience, but it wasn't preaching in the church. So.
Wow. I went through a multiple range of emotions listening to your experience at Union.
Oh.
And it really is, I'll just say I find it interesting based on where you sit now and the work that
Isn't
you do
that interesting?
now. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting.
So you get your MDiv from ILIF and return to Kansas East.
Yes.
And go through ordination and deacon first, then elder. And you're serving congregations in that time?
Yeah, so your intuition was right. I mean, ILIF was a very liberal school back then as well, which fits me theologically. I'm fairly progressive in my theology and in my kind of approach to the Christian life. But I found ILIF to be a lot less hostile in its kind of progressive take than Union was. Union was still there was a lot more anger than clarity. I mean, there was an effort. We got to tear down the man. Okay. Can we rebuild something in the wake of tearing down the man? Because that's really what I'm interested in. I mean, the deconstruction has to happen, but what about the reconstruction? So ILIF was a very progressive place. I had a really good experience there. The faculty were great. Students there were great. I have lifelong friends from my experience at ILIF. So, and I spent all of my student loan money on camping gear for camping 4 seasons in the mountains. So I love backpacking and camping, and I'm not a huge skier. I prefer cross-country skiing, but I did a lot of skiing while I was out there, and just made the most of the mountains. That was really the draw. Mm-hmm. So that was terrific. But I came back to Kansas, and I was appointed to two churches, one in Wathena and one in Elwood, which is in the northeast corner of Kansas. And if you look at a map, it's the part of Kansas that keeps us from being a rectangle. It's where the Missouri River takes a bite out of the northeast corner of Kansas. So that's where those 2 churches are located, right across the river from St. Joe, Missouri, about an hour north of Kansas City, but very close to Nebraska. In fact, the county touches both Missouri and Nebraska, so it's the very far corner up there. And it was 2 towns whose combined population were smaller than the high school I'd attended. So it was different. And I kind of grew up there. I became a pastor for the first time. I got married when I was up there. I had my first child when I was up there. I became a husband and a dad. I kind of grew up in some ways in those 3 years at those 2 churches, and they were terrific. I came out of ILIF with I knew everything, man. I was so smart. And I had a ponytail and a full beard.
Really?
Yeah, I did. I wore it for 10 years.
I need to see the ponytail Mark Holland. I need to see that.
There's evidence out there.
No.
But so I was pastoring these 2 churches, and I was 27 when I started. And one of the women finally said to me, they said, we weren't really ready we had prayed for a younger pastor. We had hoped for someone our children's age, not our grandchildren's age. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, we were okay taking a woman. We'd never had a woman pastor, but we'd be okay with that. And we'd never had a pastor of color. We'd be fine with that. I guess we just weren't ready for a pastor with a beard. I'm like, a beard? Are you kidding me? So anyway, when I left a year later, so that conversation happened about midway through my time there, my 3 years. So when I left, I said to her, remember this conversation? She said, I do. And I said, was it really the beard that bothered you, or was the hair just too horrible to say out loud? And she said, it was too horrible. Oh. So these, they were so gracious and warm, and, no one should have to suffer through the first 3 years of any pastor learning to preach. I lived in the parsonage across the street from the church. It was a really good, endearing experience for me, living in a small town for the first time. And, coming from Kansas City, Dallas, and Denver to walking in Elwood, it was a big change, but it's what I wanted. I really wanted to be the pastor. I wanted to preach every Sunday. It was my lifetime dream. And I had some chances coming into the conference. I was offered to be a campus minister. I was offered to be an associate pastor at one of the larger churches in Kansas City. And I said no to all of it. I said, I really want to be a pastor, and I'll go anywhere. And so I was appointed up there, and it was a great experience. So those were my first 3 years, and it was different. My folks up there used the N-word a lot to describe Black people, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, it caught me off guard a lot, and my now ex-wife, my wife Julie, and I, we sat down and talked. And we had to come up with a strategy because we couldn't just remain silent like this. And so we came up with we had to come up with something to say. So we decided we would say, I don't think Jesus wants us to talk like that anymore. We had to put Jesus in there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we had to say something. And so we did. We started saying that. And it would happen in meetings. It would happen in casual conversation. It happened at the bank. It would happen at the post office. And I would just say, and Julie would say, I don't think Jesus wants us to talk like that anymore. And it did have an impact. I mean, it gradually people stopped saying it around us.
Yeah.
But I was surprised at how easily that language tripped off the tongue of church members. Having grown up in a very diverse environment, that was never. Now SMU was not diverse, and Iliff wasn't super diverse, but Dallas is diverse, and so is Denver. Schools themselves were not. But I just couldn't believe it. But I do think that that was something to learn and grow from, because having to find your prophetic witness on the fly at age 27 with people who are my grandparents' age.
Yeah.
Tough.
Well, and I think it does speak to, sort of these parallel conversations of how do folks with progressive leaning theology remain in conversation with fundamentalists.
Right.
And there's the pulpit of conversation, and then there is the seeing them in the grocery store and in the bank, and places where preaching is not really appropriate. And so there has to be another way to speak to those systemic sins,
right,
that doesn't necessarily look like just bringing the man down, if you will.
Right. Well, I had an experience too while I was in Wathena and Elwood. There was literally a cross burning in a yard in St. Joe, Missouri, with a family who turns out they were from Europe, Mediterranean from Europe. But they were new to the neighborhood, and the cross was literally burned in their yard, and it made the news. And so I preached about it, and I had this really radical sermon. I said, and I just asked people, do you know people personally who would burn a cross in somebody's yard? Everybody knows. Yep. We all know somebody who would do that, either family or acquaintances. I mean, people know who that tribe is. And I said, I think we need to be nice to Black people. And then I said, and people who don't speak English, I think we need to be nice to people who don't speak English in this country. And I said, and I think we need to be nice to gay people. Okay, let's pray. That was my whole sermon right there. I mean, that was as radical as it got. We should be nice to people. And you know how the church people are, they meet in the parking lot afterwards, and they assign someone whose job it is to go talk to the preacher on Monday. So they assigned this woman, and she came in and saw me on Monday, and she said, okay, your sermon, it was good, which it really maybe wasn't a very good sermon, but, she said it was good. And we agree, we've talked about it. We agree that we should be nice to Black people, and we agree that we should be nice to people that don't speak English. But I don't think there's any gay people in Elwood, Kansas. And of course, I was young, so my pastoral filter was not well refined. I blurted out, well, if you were gay, would you live in Elwood, Kansas? And she thought about it for a minute, and she said, no, I'd move to Kansas City. And I said, I would too. And, maybe we can be nice to gay people so they don't have to move to Kansas City. She said, oh, I see what you're saying. So, that's that little, you talk about the progressive theology. I mean, is that progressive?
I would not say so.
I wouldn't think so. But finding your voice, and I've said this everywhere I've gone, you always have to find your voice. And finding my voice for the first time as a pastor, it took a while. And when I changed appointments, it took a while. And when everything I've done, I've had to find my voice anew. And you kind of got to find it based on the circumstances in which you're serving.
Let me ask a question on that. Looking back, on your years of ministry, and particularly at the intersections that you found yourself in. I sometimes, look back on my, ministry and wonder, like, maybe I was a little too harsh with some folks. And then there are some times that I'm like, gosh, I should have gone in. Like, I really should have gone in.
Yep.
When you think about these moments, with those first congregations and encountering the N-word and encountering language and ideas that are dehumanizing of others, do you look back and well, they were just trying to figure out their lives and I'm a disruptor? Or do you look back and like, gosh, I was going to be gone anyway, so I might as well have just gone all the way in? Like, right. How do you reflect on that?
I felt pretty good about the balance I found in my first appointment. I felt pretty good about, I don't feel like there was ever an issue that came up that we swept under the carpet. I tried to address them as best I could. And I do think, no regrets. I always say in life, reflections, no regrets, right? That I don't look back at any situation. I mean, my hardest one was an 80-year-old member of the trustees was showing me his garden, and he used the N-word. And I was afraid to say something, but I girded my loins and I said, I don't think Jesus wants us to talk that way anymore. And he stared at me for a really long time. And then he finally said, yeah, you're probably right. And then we went on with our conversation. But I just thought, this guy is not going to be moved by an interesting sermon about race relations and race, such. But that little bit of a witness of what can he absorb in this moment and what can I muster?
Yeah.
That was, I just had never heard those words come out of an adult mouth before. And a church member, a trustee at the church. So I felt pretty good about it. I left feeling like, was there more to do? Sure. But you'd have to be there longer, right? You'd have to, you'd have to commit long-term. I was there 3 years. But it was a good experience. I would say it was a good experience. And it does mess up the racist people are evil, are all evil. And it messes up the homophobic people are all bad people. And it does really kind of say, okay, people are complicated and people have blind spots and people grew up in areas that are different. Explanation, no excuse, right? It really kind of explains the human condition. It doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't make it right. It still needs to be challenged and confronted and addressed. But it was interesting for me because I always assumed people that use the N-word were just the evil people out there that were wearing hoods. I didn't know people in churches use that language. And so I had to, it was a little mind-blowing, but it was, and coming out of a very politically correct culture at ILF.
Yeah, I bet.
Where you tiptoed around in class based on what you said, it was a very different environment, but it did, I had an appreciation for some folks who have a long way to go on race relations, have a long way to go on human sexuality issues, who, are making it through the day somehow. So earned some compassion, but also kind of redoubled my commitment to, we've got to address these issues. They are more present than we think.
Yeah.
We have to address it. And so that's, that was a pretty important part of my start to ministry.
Yeah. So tell me how we get to Mayor Mark Holland.
Well, that's interesting too. So I was appointed to Trinity in Kansas City, Kansas. I had a chance to come home to my hometown. and pastored at Trinity for 18 years, 19 years, 19 years from 99 to 18.
Okay.
And I wanted to come back to Kansas City, Kansas. I had asked to come back to Kansas City, Kansas. That's not, I don't know if you know how the appointment system works. That's not how it works.
Oh, I'm aware. I'm not in it, but I'm aware.
One of the things that also happened was Scott Jones became our bishop. And I had advocated for his election. I voted for him. I was a delegate. I voted for him. I lobbied for him to come to Kansas City, or to Kansas at that time. And he and I got crossways not very long thereafter. And he got crossways with a lot of people. And he's crossways with the whole denomination now. I think I don't know what happened, but a lot of us who voted for him have repented of that. But one of the things I reflected on in the past was that I ran for city council in 2007. I'd been in Trinity 8 years. I'd never run for office. And so I asked people, I'm thinking about running for the school board. And I know I had colleagues who had served on school board, and I thought about city council. So I asked around and people said, you ought to run for city council. Where do you live? And I told them, they said, well, you ought to run again for city council against that guy because we could use an upgrade there. And I did. I ran. I had no idea what I was doing. I have some friends who did know what they were doing. So I ran this first campaign and I was elected by 35 votes out of 13,000 cast, which I called a mandate of the people. But I barely won against a big name incumbent who had served for 16 years in public office. His brother was a state senator, just a big name in the community, but he didn't do anything, and I beat him. And I served 6 years I served for 4 years, and I had to get permission from my wife in this order, from the bishop and from my staff parish. And so everyone was willing. The bishop did say initially, and I give Scott Jones credit for this, he did support my appointment while I was running for office. But he did say, well, you can't take any money from it. You can't have another job. And I was like, or he's going to make me go 3/4 time, so that I can justify another job. But then that messes with your pension, all this stuff. So I said, well, I really hate to do that, and he said, well, how much is it? And I said, well, it pays $1,000 a month. And he laughed and he said, okay, you can keep that. So he didn't make me go 3/4 time, which I appreciated, but I did serve for 4 years and had a good experience, and we all agreed to do it again. So I ran and was reelected easily the second time. And then 2 years in, the current mayor, Joe Reardon, reached out to me, who we all thought was going to run for a third term. He said to me confidentially, he said, I'm not going to run. I think you should run for mayor, and I'll endorse you. So we talked it over again with my wife, with the bishop. It would mean that I needed to go 1/4 time at the church because it's a full-time job. Mayor's full-time.
Yeah.
Or I needed to leave the church altogether. Let me tell you about my hindsight. If I knew then what I know now, I would have left the church and just taken a leave of absence from the church and just been mayor. Doing both was too much. But I was elected mayor and served for 4 years. Now, reflecting on that, it didn't occur to me at the time, but it was pretty clear to me there was no place for my leadership in the Kansas East Conference with Bishop Jones. I had never been Bishop Moody had put me on new church development. I cycled off of that after 7 years. But I was never asked to serve on any committee in Kansas East or the new Great Plains Conference. And so I didn't run for office thinking, I'm never going to get into the conference, so I'll have to do something else. I mean, the only leadership position I've had in the conference was the delegation, which I continued to get elected to. So knowing that there was no room for me under Jones, intuitively, is part of why I had more. I felt like I had more leadership to offer, and then I invested into my local community, and was fortunate that I was able to stay at the church. Jones did appoint me to quarter time, so I could stay at Trinity. I had a good experience in elected office and local government, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. I learned a lot. I like to say I was on a 10-year in-service in municipal government. But it did give me an opportunity to address some of the bigger issues, to address the blight in the community. I say everyone deserves to live in a neighborhood they're proud of. Everyone deserves to live in a home that they're proud of. And having these blighted properties, we needed to shift resources into cleaning up the blight. We needed to shift resources into sidewalks around bus stops. We needed to shift resources. We needed to think about crime and such. One of the things I did is I was one of my first, I hadn't been mayor 6 weeks, and I was sitting on the dais for the graduation of the fire department. And I watched, 25, 30 very qualified people walk across the stage to become firefighters. Not a single African American, and only one woman. Now, the city is only 40% white. How did we end up with a 99% white class, or all white class? Well, I started asking questions and asking more questions. And then I made the decision with some community leaders to invite the Department of Justice in to have a conversation with our public safety, police, fire, and sheriff, which is 60%, by the way, of the budget of the city. Those three combined are 60% of the budget, public safety. And ask the question about recruiting, hiring, promoting, and retaining people of color and women in these departments. Because these are good paying jobs that people in our community could use. Our median household income in our city at the time was $42,000 a year. And all of these paid more than that. So these are good, and that's median household income. This is one earner. So this is good money, and this is a good opportunity. Well, it turns out, so we did an 18-month process. I convened a community-wide group. Every commissioner, there are 10 commissioners. We call our city council commissioners. Each commissioner appointed someone to the task force. I appointed the chairs, the co-chairs, and we invited the sheriff, police chief, and fire police chief and fire chief. We invited the heads of all the unions. The unions all declined to come. But we invited everybody, and then we did an 18-month process that resulted in 30 different recommendations that were all adopted by the commission on a 9-1 vote. So we had a really good piece, and I wanted to have a community-wide group because I wanted it to be based in the community and not just in the mayor's office, because the mayor's office is transitory. And the community, though, is around. So this was, so that kind of work of, that's more than you can do in the church, right? You don't get to look at this kind of practice. And we started this actually 9 months before Ferguson. Ferguson, Missouri is just 4 hours away from Kansas City, north of St. Louis, or near St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And the Michael Brown shooting was rocking St. Louis nearby, and we had already begun this conversation. And my whole point is, policing with a police force that reflects the community is a better police force. And having public safety that reflects the community is better public safety. So I was really proud of that work, but it came at a cost.
Yeah.
It came at a cost, but looking at the things you could do in the mayor's office to address some of the insidious problems of your city and in the community was really powerful and a real privilege to do.
Gosh. This is a dangerous question I'm going to ask. Did you feel more at home behind the mayor's desk than behind the preacher's desk?
It's an interesting question that I've thought a lot about. I do think my calling is to the church. And I do think there's a role in public office for value-driven people. And I would say that there was a lot about the mayor's office and serving as commissioner that I found very rewarding. Rewarding enough that I ran for re-election for mayor. I lost that election. The fire department made it a goal to get rid of me because I raised questions about their contract and their ethical or unethical behavior, and I published names and dates and amounts. But I thought enough. I enjoyed public office enough, and when I left the mayor's office in 2018, I decided I'd been 19 years at Trinity. It was time to step down from Trinity as well. I was just ready for a change. It was time for something new, which I didn't know what it was. That something new became mainstream UMC. And so I left office in January of 18. And I went to the Council of Bishops meeting in Chicago to observe that spring when the One Church plan was adopted by them, was accepted by them when they received the report and accepted the One Church plan. And then the traditional plan was going to be written. And I got together with my friend, Reverend Dr. Nanette Roberts, she's now retired, but she was the senior pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in Olathe, which is our largest progressive church in the Great Plains Conference. And she and I co-founded Mainstream UMC to be the voice and really served as the PAC of the campaign to pass the One Church plan. So that started, we had nothing. We had an idea. And we took that idea to annual conference in June, thinking we're going to need to raise $250,000 to do this. And my theory was there's $1 million worth of angst in the United Methodist Church right now. We only need a quarter of it.
Yeah.
But we need $250,000 to run this campaign the way we think we need to run it, to have some paid staff and to go after it. And we went to annual conference and raised $60,000 at annual conference and went live July 1. So there was a really positive response, and it started the 8-month sprint to St. Louis in 2019. But that's really how it started. And it was a lot, my view is to paraphrase our Lord, where two or more are gathered, there will be politics also. And the legislative process of General Conference is an inherently political operation. Right. To treat it as such. We didn't choose the rules, but there are people on the other side who understand the political process and actively work it. And we can choose to be offended by that, or we can win. Yeah. And so the model was, let's go win. And so we made a run at it. And of course, we came up 50 votes short. We needed 26 people to change their mind. And we didn't get it. So yeah, that's how Mainstream was born.
Oh. Let's take a quick break. So, Mark, we were both on the floor of the special session in 2019, and we both know how it turned out. We both had moments at the mic. when you think back to, and this is the question, when you think back to the work you put into mainstream leading up to 2019, what are you grateful for?
I'm grateful we did the work. I'm grateful we didn't lay down to see what would happen. I'm grateful we didn't say it's somebody else's issue to deal with. I'm grateful that there was a coalition of folks around the country of people who are both left and right of center, who love the church, and love the church not because of the institution. I mean, we all learned the little children's game with your fingers, this is the building, this is the church is the people. I think it's about the people, and I'm really grateful. And there was a group of folks who said, we can't stand down. What's happening to our church is wrong. There is already a Southern Baptist church in this country. We don't need to be another one. We need to be United Methodist, which means we ordain women, and we are the largest denomination in the world that ordains women, that does not ordain gay and lesbian people. And we are the largest church in the United States that ordains women, that doesn't ordain gay and lesbian people. And we're one of the last mainline Protestants that doesn't. And so, and we also know that what happened with our church was not reflective of the U.S. delegates. And that gets sensitive in a hurry, right? You talk about intersectional justice, of dealing with folks in a global environment, of being culturally aware and sensitive, and needing justice in this country. And so for me, it was a big blow. I had marched in my first gay pride parade in 1988 at SMU. I ran for student body president at SMU, and lost in a spectacular landslide. I actually received 600 votes. There were 600 votes cast the year before total, and I received 600 votes and lost 2-1. But I included in my materials, support for the gay and lesbian students who had been denied access to the student senate as an organization. So, ILIF was very open and affirming. And at Trinity, we had an open and affirming church. We had a lot of gay members who were active at all levels of the church. We actually became a reconciling church prior to 2016. And it's a hilarious story. We were getting ready for General Conference, and a retired pastor, John Stone King, one of my mentors, who recently passed away, he said, I think we ought to become a reconciling congregation and officially join RMN. We've never done it. And our district superintendent, who was new and leaned a little more conservative, he jumped in and said, oh, look, there's a process for that. There's materials. You want to have a long conversation with the church. There's a lot of things to do. Move for approval. Second. All in favor. Unanimous. Like, he couldn't even finish talking, and someone just said, move for approval. And then said, I think we ought to send him some money. And they're like, well, how much? He's like, I don't know. I think we should send him $5,000. Move for approval. Second. Done. So but he wanted, prior to 2016, to add our name to the roster of churches that were supportive of RMN. So that's how we became a reconciling congregation at Trinity, officially a reconciling congregation. So I felt like we've been working on this my whole ministry.
Yeah.
And seeing how ready, and so many great mentors of mine in ministry in Great Plains, in Kansas East and Great Plains, who were gay in the closet. And, it was scary when Jones was here, because he was so adamant about the trials. So everybody really kept their head down even more with Jones around. So he just worked, I think, to intimidate everybody into submission. So really, we were highly motivated to get this changed. So for me in St. Louis, like everyone, it was just devastating. And it was particularly upsetting that 2/3 of the U.S. delegates voted against it, against the traditional plan, voted for the one church plan. And it was votes from outside the United States. I mean, 60% of the votes for the traditional plan, 60% of them came from outside the United States. And the irony is, it really only imposed on the U.S. church, and that's there's a justice issue there. I mean, there's a problem, and so for me, it left me, like most of us, pretty agitated and animated. And mainstream was going to be done. We had signed up for 8 months. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to keep going. And so we redoubled our efforts. We continued for the next year. We worked hard supporting folks running for delegate in the spring of 2019. We had a very successful elections in the U.S. We shifted.
And let me ask a question about that, because you were about to say that you shifted the equation in many ways of the delegations going into General Conference that we end up not having yet. But do you feel like, I mean, I'm just aware that without the special session of 2019, we don't get the annual conference sessions of 2019, that those were direct responses to the special session. And so do you draw any straight lines from your work with mainstream to the annual conference sessions? I mean, in Florida, only centrists and progressives were elected to our delegation. Right. And that is a story. There's a similar story across the U.S. connection. Do you think that some of that was because of the work?
Some of it was. It was a much broader coalition than just mainstream. I mean, we tried to do our part. I wouldn't give us credit for that. I think it was a lot of grassroots folks, a lot of folks who'd never heard of mainstream that were doing that work. I think we were certainly tapping into the ethos of the time and matched the ethos of the time. But we were providing a lot of materials, a lot of resources, a lot of information, a lot of connecting folks to try to work those elections. So I wouldn't say that I'd be hesitant for me or for mainstream to take a lot of direct credit for those elections, other than we were a part of the mix. We were one of the voices in it. And we were all in. But it was such a broad-based movement that it was just grassroots. I mean, people just rose up. And it's kind of personal for me too. I was at the General Conference in 2016, Portland, and made the motion asking the bishops to lead us forward out of this mess. We had just had there was a petition in committee to allow funding to help prevent suicide among LGBTQ youth. And that petition failed in committee. And there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, it was bad. People were going ape and very angry, very upset, and rightfully so. I mean, what church doesn't say we're going to support ending suicide for gay youth? I mean, it's outrageous that failed in committee. And so it was in the light of that the bishops were going to make a speech. The bishop did do a presentation. I thought it was completely worthless because it didn't address the elephant in the room. And so at lunch, I was talking to some members of the delegation, and I said, of Great Plains, and I said, I think we ought to make a motion. We ought to ask the bishops to lead, and make a motion, ask the bishops to lead. Oh, don't do that. You can't upset the bishops. Oh, don't do that. Well, I went to Adam Hamilton and I said, Adam, I think we should do this. He said, oh, I think that's a great idea. If you make the motion, I'll second it and speak to it. So I made the motion asking the bishops to lead. Adam seconded it. It passed. Well, it didn't pass. Then it did pass. And it was kind of a mess. And then the bishops all left and came back with the plan to do the Commission on the Way Forward. And We voted to accept their work, and that was a shenanigan. We almost didn't accept their suggestion. Finally did. And it started. So from that point, watching this process going to 2019, I felt like I had a personal investment in it, if you will. And then watching it fail, of all that work, I mean, 2 years of work, 3 years of work since 2016, all the work the bishops put in, the commission on the way forward, to be completely sabotaged by traditionalists who just who want control of the church and want trials and want to kick people out. It was just devastating, absolutely devastating.
I'm connecting the story that you told about union to this moment now. And I know that you stayed in communication, though maybe it's strategic, but stayed in communication with traditionalists, those who've left, those who've stayed. I'm curious, what keeps you in conversation with those traditionalists? And maybe it is just strategy, but what keeps you talking to individuals who are not just seeing the world differently, but using your words, interested in controlling the forward movement of the church, particularly in the US?
Yeah. Well, I do think it is partly strategic. I think we need to be a little more transactional in how we communicate with people to get things done politically. I would say I'm willing and able to do that. Though what's funny is it seems very edgy in the church, and I'm not near edgy enough that way for politics. But it's just, having been in the political world of how you get votes, whipping votes. I told everyone that the IQ required to be mayor was the ability to count to 6. Because if you can't get 6 votes, you can't do anything. You can't even adjourn your meeting. You can't do anything.
Yeah.
So if you can't count to 6, you're sunk. And I think vote counting is a part of it. And I think talking to people with whom you disagree is essential to get to what you want. I also think, from a personal perspective, that while I feel passionately about inclusion, I also, it goes back to kind of my discussion with the trustees too, at my first church, that I can't put people in a box that it's all bad people who think this way, that people are more complicated than that. And there's a lot of reasons people come at what they do and why they do it. And so I think that makes me more sympathetic. I'm much more sympathetic with groups, people who genuinely believe what they talk about, versus the folks who use this language for power and such. I look at a character like Ted Cruz, who would talk out of both sides of his mouth for whatever political gain he can get. I have very little respect for some of the things the Institute for Religion and Democracy does. They have accused, the National Council of Churches and mainline churches of being Marxist. I mean, they're so far right and out there. That group's hard to talk to. I can say the folks at Good News, WCA, GMC, through the years, I've had more constructive conversations with, just about, what do you want? What do we want? Is there a way to work together? And it turns out there's, there is a point at which, no, you can't work together. You're going to work against each other. But I do think that dialogue is important. And I do think how we do accountability matters. I think we do need to do accountability for the harm that's being caused. And I think we need to, I had someone write to me recently, we don't want to become them. We don't want to be mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a part of the challenge. But I do think staying in dialogue and respecting people, even when you fundamentally disagree, I think is what the gospel calls us to do. I think that's the passage John 17 of unity in Christ. Jesus didn't say, I want you to all agree. I want you to love one another. And I don't feel like the way the trials and such really reflect that love. And that's why we need to stop them.
Mark, one of the things that people appreciate about you, and I'll just name that some people also are concerned at times that you bring to the table. You do bring a degree of political acumen that most of our clergy, the majority of our clergy, particularly United Methodist clergy, just don't seem to have. You are willing to tell the truth from your perspective unapologetically. You are willing to say out loud things like, you got to know how to count to 6, that we sometimes don't want to do, because then it's a vote and it's election. It's not a spiritually discerned moment, how do you balance your understanding of the politics of our institution with your call? How do you hold those together?
That's an interesting question. I did my doctoral work at St. Paul on holy conferencing, and was really struck by John Wesley's adamant belief that holy conferencing is a means of grace, similar to communion, Bible study, worship. Holy conferencing, he put on that same level. He put church meetings as important as a means of grace, or as a means of grace, just like these other things that are sacred. And he elevated church meetings to the level of sacred, and believing that, I used the phrase earlier, where 2 or more are gathered, there'll be politics also. That scripture, where 2 or more are gathered, I will be present with you, is a conflict scripture. It's about, how do you deal with people in the church who aren't doing the right thing? Well, you go to them one by one. And if they don't listen, then you bring 3 people with you. And if that doesn't work, then you bring them before the congregation. And if that doesn't work, you kick them out. Well, Jesus said, in these conversations, I will be present with you. That's where he said that. And I think that, and John Wesley's view of holy conferencing, when the Spirit is present in the discerning process, that there's something good that happens. And so for me, that was my whole doctoral work, was looking at, and I convened as part of that a conversation with the 10 Methodist churches in Kansas City, Kansas, about mission and ministry and what we're doing here. And had tried to have structure a holy conference around what we do as churches in an urban area that are struggling to reach people. So I think it's a pretty integral part. I do think the political process, politics is neither good nor evil, right? It just is what it is. It's a process of how people get things done. Mm-hmm. And, there's politics in the family. There's politics in the pew. There's politics everywhere we go. I think we need to appreciate that this is how we've done it. And I'm grateful we have a democratic system in the United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. We would not do well under an authoritarian model where there's a big dude in charge and we all say, okay. That wouldn't fly.
It wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't.
We wouldn't still be there. Though I do tell everybody, the Methodists were only one divorce short of being Catholic ourselves, right? If Henry VIII hadn't wanted a divorce, he wouldn't have formed the Church of England. And if we didn't have the Church of England, we wouldn't have the Methodists.
Now that's a whole conversation we'll have another day, Mark, because yeah.
So I do think that political work connects with my calling in terms of working for the greater good, working together for the greater good. I think that's why we come together for worship. I think that's why we come together in Bible study. I think that's why we come together for elections. We got to work together for the greater good. And that's, and I think if we have if we're willing to embrace that process and not just write it off and embrace it as holy conferencing, I think that makes it powerful and workable.
As you look back over the last few years, the protocol, then the COVID pandemic, postponing of General Conference, the launch of the GMC disaffiliations. What have you learned about the politics of holy conferencing?
Well, it's interesting. You talk about after 19 and the pandemic has really changed everything. And I can tell you personally, I went through a lot of loss through 19 and 20. I left Trinity after 19 years. It was a huge loss of community. I'd raised my kids there. They appointed a biblical literalist after me who chased off all the gay people by the end of the summer and all their allies by Christmas and voted a year later to close the church.
Oh my.
Which is a devastating loss for our community and for the folks, not just in the church, but it was, a big loss. I went through a divorce in 2020, which is the greatest loss and grief I've ever experienced. And then feeling like we're losing the church. This generational long love affair of my family with the church. There's just a lot of layers of loss. And so for me personally, I have experienced loss in ways over the last 3 years that I've never experienced before. And experience that loss with the sure and certain hope of resurrection to new life, right? And that it's funny that in the midst of some of that loss, one of the things that came to me is the funeral liturgy that I've preached 170 times. That says, when we bury someone, we do so in the sure and certain hope of resurrection. And looking at 2019 in that lens, the St. Louis meeting, looking at divorce in the lens of the sure and certain hope of resurrection, looking at the loss of Trinity and believing in resurrection. I mean, I think that for me, so I've been on sort of a personal journey of loss and resurrection similar to where the church is, and so I think what I learned about holy conferencing is it's a lot about finding resurrection and joining together with the people of faith to do the work. And there's a lot of holy conferencing that goes on with our mainstream board members meetings. There's holy conferencing that goes on with the coalition meeting groups that are meeting. Mm-hmm. I've had the privilege of traveling around the country, both in 19 and 20, as well as now again, talking to different groups about what's happening at General Conference. And it's our church is in need of resurrection. The post-pandemic church, I say it this way, the church is church is hard on a good day. I mean, you ask our pastors who are toiling in the pulpit, and it's hard on a good day. And I have pastors who tell me you're not really a pastor because you missed the whole pandemic. I was not in the local church during the pandemic. I was not in a local church during 2019 with the gay and lesbian issue. I was not in the church during disaffiliations. So I have colleagues at Great Plains who are like, you're not even a pastor anymore. You sat out the most important part of the ministry, the hardest part of the ministry. So yeah, I think that what I've learned about holy conferencing is and it's one thing too, you've got to work at it. You got to push. And I think one of the number one, if I were to write a leadership book, it'd be called Push, because I think that's what leaders do. I think you push for change. You push and push and push. And I think I think we have to continue to push for General Conference. And that's one of my concerns. And one of the things that mainstream is trying to say, screaming, don't go back to sleep. This isn't over yet. And it could get bad. Like, the options on the table are, this is a Rubicon moment, a point of no return for the church. We absolutely have to get this right in 2024. And so we need to continue to push, and we need to push through our own sense of loss around the pandemic and around the disaffiliations, the loss of friendships and colleagues and churches, and the loss of just the loss. And we can't let 2024 be about loss. 2024 needs to be about resurrection. And I think we need to be people of faith to speak into that. And as the Baptists say, name it and claim it. We need 2024 to be a point of resurrection for the church, because it's been hard.
Yeah.
It's been hard.
Do you have hope for the United Methodist Church?
I do. Part of it is rooted in, I'm a third generation pastor in 3 different Methodist structures. My great-grandfather was in the ME South. My dad was in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and I was he was in the Methodist Church, and I'm in the United Methodist Church. And these denominational names and structures ebb and flow over time. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. But I do have hope. I mean, the church struggled with slavery and split. And then we reunited under very dubious circumstances in a time of segregation. And then we ordained women in 1956, 36 years after women received the right to vote in this country. 1972, we finally removed the prohibitions against divorced pastors serving in churches. That same year, we added prohibitions for gay and lesbian people. So the church has been this stutter step forward of progress, of grace. I had a conservative pastor call me, it's been a couple years ago, from Iowa. He said, now you should know I'm one of the leaders of the WCA here, but I just, here's my concern. First, it's gay and lesbian people. Then it's LGBT, bisexual people, LGBTQ, he's not sure what Q stands for, LGBTQT, transgendered people. And he said, really, where does it end? How many more letters? What are you asking people to accept? And I thought about it, and I said, I don't know. Where does the grace of Jesus Christ end? I don't know. I mean, we ordained women in 1956. We took away the prohibitions for divorce. In 72, we have continually we desegregated our church in name. We're still working on the practice. Amen. But we have continued to extend grace to marginalized people. Honestly, I don't know where the grace ends. And so my hope for the United Methodist Church is that the grace will continue to win out. The grace will continue to move forward. The grace will continue to call us to new places, even when we're uncomfortable or undecided or unaware. That prevenient grace that John Wesley preaches is going to continue to pursue us and continue to enlighten us and continue to fill us. My hope for the United Methodist Church is that grace moves forward. Rob Bell's book was Love Wins. My hope for the United Methodist Church is that grace wins. So that's my hope for the church.
Mark, I am just deeply grateful for your willingness to share on this podcast so much of your life. And I'm thankful for the ways that you continue to learn from your journey. And even the last few years of disappointment and loss, you're still out there fighting the good fight of faith and grace in the spaces that you're occupying. And so I just want to thank you for your work. Grateful for your witness and your advocacy, especially in this season of the church. And just grateful for your friendship, man. My goodness.
Well, Derek, I'm grateful for you. I appreciate your work with Mainstream. I appreciate your ministry with the podcast of lifting voices up, and your ministry with young people in college.
Oh, my fave. Fave.
And your work as the co-lay leader in Florida. You're certainly using your leadership for the good of the kingdom. And so I thank you for that.
Oh, I appreciate it, brother. Thanks for being on the podcast, man.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.